My name is Henry, and I am 98 years old. I have lived long enough to bury my wife, long enough to watch my closest friends disappear one by one, long enough to see even old rivalries lose their heat and fade into silence. Somewhere along the way, I also left behind the man I used to be, the one who worried too much about approval, reputation, and keeping up appearances. At this stage, there is nothing left to impress. I feel like an old man standing at the edge of a long drop, able to see everything below with a clarity that only comes when there's nowhere left to run, and before I take that final step, I feel a responsibility to turn back and speak to those of you still laughing, still busy, still convinced the night will never end, because what I see from here is very different from what you believe. The truth is, you are living inside a comforting story that tells you time is generous and forgiving. You move through your days as if they cost nothing, as if there is always more waiting somewhere ahead, neatly stored for later use. You postpone what matters and exhaust yourself on what doesn't, convinced you can always make it right someday. I'm not saying you don't understand that life ends. You do, in a distant, intellectual way. But understanding something and carrying it inside you are two very different things. And if you truly felt how fragile this all is, you would not be living the way you are now. When the reality of an ending presses close enough to be felt, it changes how you breathe, how you listen, how you choose. And that is something most people never experience until it is already pressing on their chest, which is why I want to tell you about someone I once knew, a man named Robert, a memory from many years ago, from a very different world. It was the early 70s, and Robert was the closest friend I had. He was sharper than I was, carried himself with confidence, and had a way of moving through rooms as if he already belonged there. Opportunities seemed to find him without effort, and success came early. One evening, we sat together after he had closed a deal everyone said would change his life. He leaned back in his chair, calm and satisfied, and spoke with certainty about his plan. Just a few more years of pushing, just a little more sacrifice, and then he would finally slow down, finally travel, finally give himself permission to explore the things he said he loved, but never had time for. He spoke as if life were something he could renegotiate later, as if living was scheduled to begin only after all the important work was finished, and he believed in that promise so completely that none of us questioned it. Not even him. I remember that night more clearly than I wish I did. Nothing about it felt urgent. Nothing felt fragile. We talked the way young men do when they believe time is loyal, when tomorrow feels solid and dependable. Robert spoke calmly, confidently, as if the future were already signed and waiting for him, and I nodded along because his certainty was convincing. Because certainty is contagious when you are young and still believe plans have power. For years after he was gone, I replayed that conversation in my mind. I wondered how many times I had said the same thing in my own way, how often I had postponed joy with the quiet promise that it would be safer to live later, when things were settled, when work slowed down, when life finally made room, never realizing that the moment you keep waiting for is rarely the one that arrives. 3 days later, Robert collapsed outside his office building before he had time to understand what was happening. There was no warning, no second chance, no final conversation. He was 43 years old. The places he dreamed of seeing remained names on a map. The interests he promised himself never left his imagination. I stood beside his coffin, surrounded by people speaking about potential and legacy, and I realized the real tragedy wasn't that his life ended. It was that he spent all of it preparing for a moment that never came. He lived as though his real life was always just beyond reach, waiting patiently somewhere in the future. And that illusion followed him right to the end. which became even clearer when I returned to his office days later to collect his belongings, and saw how full his calendar still was, how urgent his unfinished plans appeared, as if the world expected him to return at any moment. His calendar was filled for months ahead, meetings stacked on top of meetings, messages marked urgent, demanding attention as if nothing had changed. The world did not slow down because Robert was gone. His position was filled within weeks. His name stopped coming up not long after that. Life moved on without hesitation, and standing here now, looking at you, I recognize the same pattern forming because you are telling yourself the very same story he told himself. You say you will finally feel at peace when the promotion comes through. You say you will travel when the children are grown. You say you will make things right with your brother when he reaches out first. Let me tell you something plainly, from a man who has lived nearly a century. There is no later waiting patiently for you. There is only what you choose to do now, and every time you trade what you have today for a future that is not promised, you are placing a bet you may never live long enough to collect. There comes a time when a person begins to sort through what they've gathered, not because they want to, but because life starts asking for less. Boxes get packed slowly. Drawers are opened and closed. Objects that once felt important lose their weight in your hands, and you begin to see how little of it holds the moments you thought they did. What stays are not the things themselves, but the memories attached to them, and even those do not belong to the objects for very long, which is when you start to understand how easily a lifetime of accumulation can turn into someone else's responsibility, waiting quietly to be cleared away. And that brings me to the way you surround yourself with things, because I watch your generation carry a quiet exhaustion that comes from chasing more than you can ever enjoy. You fill your homes with objects meant to impress people whose opinions do not last, using money borrowed from time you have not yet lived, convincing yourself that the next purchase will finally make you feel settled. I live in a single room now. There is a bed. There is a chair. There is one photograph of my wife that I look at every morning. There was a time when I owned a large house, a time when I had expensive cars and a garage full of things I thought mattered. With the clarity that only comes near the end, I can tell you none of it followed me here, and none of it speaks to me now. I have attended more funerals than I can count, and never once have I seen belongings come along for the ride. When a person is gone, what they treasured becomes a task for someone else. Most of it is discarded without ceremony. What remains is passed along cheaply, stripped of the meaning it once carried. That is what accumulation becomes when time runs out. So I ask you to consider what it is costing you. Why you are exhausting yourself week after week, missing moments you will never be offered again, trading evenings and childhood memories for payments on things that spend most of their lives sitting still. It looks sensible while you are in motion, but from where I am sitting now, it looks like confusion disguised as ambition, a confusion most people do not recognize until they find themselves exactly where I am. By the time you realize what it cost you, there is no receipt to bring back, and no counter willing to take it in. Some things are final once they are spent, which reminds me of what I once believed was my greatest achievement. It was the late 1970s when I was honored as Businessman of the Year in my city. There was a formal dinner, dark suits, polished shoes, careful speeches. I walked up to the stage while people applauded, and for a brief moment I felt as though I had arrived, as though I had solved something important. I went home that night carrying a small trophy, convinced it meant more than it did. The house was quiet when I walked in. My wife, Eleanor, was already asleep. The children were asleep too. I sat alone at the kitchen table, holding that piece of glass, and slowly it became clear that the noise had stayed behind at the banquet. The applause did not follow me home. The people who clapped for me cared about results, not about who I was. And the people upstairs, the ones who loved me without conditions, had barely seen me for weeks so I could earn that moment on a stage. I missed my son's games because I told myself the office needed me. I missed an anniversary dinner because a deal was almost finished. At the time, those choices felt responsible. Now they feel heavy. That award is somewhere in a box I no longer remember packing. But the look in my wife's eyes when I told her I would not be home for dinner has never left me, and it still sits with me when the room is quiet. You may believe your work defines you, but it does not. It is an exchange. You trade hours of your life for output, and those hours never come back to you. If you were gone tomorrow, the role you fill would be advertised before the ink dried on your name. Work does not grieve. It does not sit beside you when the lights dim. It will not return the devotion you give it. So if money loses its shine and achievement fades quickly and possessions do not follow you, you may wonder what remains when everything else falls away. And the answer is simpler than most people expect. The only things that stay with you are what you offered freely, the time you gave without watching the clock, the kindness you showed when there was nothing to gain, the connections that required your presence, not your productivity. When I sit alone now, I do not revisit contracts or negotiations. I return to quiet mornings with Eleanor, the sound of my daughter laughing before she knew how quickly life moves, the memory of helping a stranger without being asked, moments that still feel alive because they were real. That is why I feel compelled to speak to you now. Not with instructions, but with a challenge shaped by years that can no longer be reclaimed. The first thing I would tell you is to loosen your grip on pride. So much of what holds people back is the fear of looking foolish. It keeps them silent when they want to speak, cautious when they want to try, distant when they want to love. Most people are not judging you the way you imagine. They are busy managing their own doubts, and the opinions you fear will not matter to anyone for very long. Another practice worth carrying is learning to treat ordinary moments as if they may not repeat. One day you will do familiar things for the last time, and you will not know it while it is happening. If you keep that truth nearby, you will notice how differently you listen, how carefully you hold moments that once passed unnoticed. And finally, I ask you to wake up to the life you still have. I am 98 years old. My body reminds me daily that time is limited. My vision has softened. My steps are slower. But you, if you are listening to this, still have movement, strength, and days that can be shaped. Do not spend them numbing yourself. Step outside. Pay attention to the world around you. Reach out to the people you love before distance becomes permanent. All of us will reach the same end. That much is certain. What is not guaranteed is that we will truly live before we arrive there. Many people stay careful, stay comfortable, and let their days quietly slip through their hands without noticing. Do not wait for the perfect moment. Do not delay the words that matter. Choose presence over postponement, because the sound you hear when everything grows quiet is not time waiting for you. It is time moving on. Thank you for listening, and I wish you all the best in life.